Well, for more analysis, let's cross over to speak to Luke Blaxill, a historian in modern British politics at the University of Oxford. It's great to have you on the programme, Luke. Rishi Sunak was speaking just a little earlier there. He apologised for the loss. But how much responsibility does he really bear here?
Well, I mean, he's become leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister at a time of real turmoil. In terms of how much personal responsibility he actually bears, well, British people do increasingly see their parliamentary elections through the prism of what you might call pseudo-presidential politics. It's not like it's the case in France, where you have a separate presidential and parliamentary elections. We have a parliamentary election in Britain, and the Prime Minister emerges from that. It's certainly true that crises at the top of the Conservative Party, where we saw the fall of Boris Johnson over the Partygate scandal, the fall of Liz Truss, over the mini-budget market crash, have, I suppose, meant that there was a crisis in leadership, undoubtedly, at the top of the Conservative Party. And Rishi Sunak stepped into that void. He was able to stabilise the markets, provide some kind of leadership, but he has been behind in the polls through all of the time he's been Prime Minister and hasn't really been able to recover the situation. So undoubtedly he does bear some responsibility, I think, for this, but the Conservative brand was already, I think, fatally damaged at the fall of Liz Truss.
And you'll know more than most people as a historian just how humiliating this is for the Conservatives. Their worst results since their founding. Give us your assessment of what has gone wrong here for the Tories.
Well, it is an absolutely crushing defeat for the Tories. This is a landslide victory for the Labour Party, a landslide defeat for the Conservatives of a magnitude that we might compare to 1832 after the Great Reform Act, to 1945 to 1947. It is an absolutely crushing defeat for them without any question. But, and I do think there is a but here, many of the forecasts, according to very sophisticated multiple variant regression analyses and opinion polls, were suggesting that the Conservatives would actually do a lot worse than the 121 seats that they have got, that they might actually be reduced to 70, 80 kind of seats, which would have made it very difficult for them even to form a functioning opposition from a constitutional perspective. So while it's true the Tories have been crushed, and this is a historic election, it is not of the fundamentally constitution-breaking kind that perhaps it threatened to be. And so while the Tories are really, really down, it'll be very, very difficult for them to be able to rebuild. They haven't been utterly and completely crushed in perhaps the extreme scenario that we thought that they might have been. And so that is a tiny little chink of hope for them, I think, that they can form just about a functional opposition, and that there are also internal and structural weaknesses in the nature of this Labour victory that has been achieved that might mean they might be able to pick up ground fairly quickly in opposition. So I don't think all hope is lost for them quite yet.
And voters clearly are very desperate for change. You know, Labour having this stunning victory. Is it more a case that people just wanted to get the Tories out than it was that people really wanted Labour in?
Overwhelmingly, I think that's true. Labour ran on I think, a pretty vacuous manifesto. They had very little in the way of concrete policy commitments, just simply running on the word change with a picture of Keir Starmer and various sort of images of sort of the countryside and things. Absolutely, it was more of a rejection of the Conservatives than an endorsement of Labour. Again, there's been some polling on this that, according to these polls, around 50% of voters that voted for the Labour Party were voting Labour primarily to punish the Conservatives, to remove the incumbent. And so this isn't a stunning landslide victory, perhaps, even though in seat numbers it is, in the way of, say, Tony Blair in 1997, where, sure, that was also an anti-Conservative victory, but I think there was genuine enthusiasm for Tony Blair, his promises, his personality and his programme. With this, even though it is a stunning victory, and I don't think anyone should take anything away from what the Labour Party and Keir Starmer has achieved, there is, I think, a slight inside lining here that this was achieved overwhelmingly as a revolt against the Conservatives by the British public, and as a consequence, there may be a little less goodwill for Keir Starmer moving forwards, even though he has a triumphant majority compared to previous prime ministers after landslides like Tony Blair and Clement Attlee.
And what are the key issues for voters here? You know, we know that the cost of living crisis is topping most of people's concerns. Tell us what the other issues are.
Well, in many ways, this was actually an election where issues perhaps didn't feature as much as you might think. The opinion polls barely moved throughout the election campaign, and really, this was, I think, a verdict on leadership. Really an anti-conservative kind of election, a punishment election, it was even being shown in some sections of the media. In terms of what issues did resonate, I suppose, well, immigration, undoubtedly a key issue. This perhaps explains why the Reform Party, this other harder right-wing party, getting about 15% of the vote and seriously damaging the Tories, did as well as they did, especially in the kinds of places where they tended to do well. And that was undoubtedly a really large issue. Another was the economy. The Conservative government under Rishi Sunak have stabilised in some ways the economy, but had never quite regained the economic trust that really fell out of the Conservatives with the Liz Truss mini-budget debacle. And so I think those are the kind of two key issues. I don't think Labour are really offering much in the way of substantive policy differences on those 2 points, but I think that really the British public just pressed the ejector seat button to get rid of the Tories, and I think just want to roll the dice with Labour and see if they'll do a better job.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on the SNP, the Scottish National Party. It's on track to have its worst general election result. They've won only 9 seats compared with 37 for Labour. Why such big losses for them? And what sort of impact will this have on their bid for independence?
Well, the Scottish National Party did triumphantly well in the 2015 election. They narrowly failed to win the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, but in a sense, the second prize they got for that was a really triumphant gain of almost all of the seats in Scotland in 2015. Now, I do think that they were always structurally, in an electoral sense, quite vulnerable to a resurgence from the Labour Party. There were a lot of seats the SNP won where Labour weren't far behind, and this is really the first time Labour have really, I suppose, put a decisive kind of electoral swing that improved their position from 2015, and that has been really what's wiped out the Scottish Nationalists, with them only winning 9 seats. Now, the SNP's main, I think, focus is really on the Holyrood, the devolved Scottish Parliament elections, and they'll be looking to try and rebuild that. But certainly, for those who care about the stability of the Union, and obviously the SNP's continual campaign to try and get another independence referendum, this is a massive setback for Scottish nationalism. And certainly it seems as though the Union and Scotland's place within it seems to be safe for the time being. The SNP will be trying to recover, though, as I say, but they'll have to become much more of just a Scottish party doing well in Scottish elections in Holyrood rather than actually a force at Westminster as they were able to be before, with around 50 MPs from Scotland.
So a setback for SNP, but elsewhere it was a big night for Nigel Farage. Not only did he finally win a seat in Parliament for the first time, his right-wing Reform UK party won around 17% of the votes. Could this be a sign that the UK is following this right-wing populist surge that we've seen in the rest of Europe?
I think that there is definitely a related factor here, yes. Now, of course, in the UK, what you could call the sort of right-wing populist parties before, the United Kingdom Independence Party and the Brexit Party, both of which Nigel Farage was strongly associated with, did, I think, well also because, obviously, of the issue of Britain's place in Europe. Now, that issue has been really settled as far as Britain is concerned, at least in the near term. And so the question is, what is there left for the populist right-wing parties? And really it's immigration, I think, more than it is anything else. The so-called stop the boats kind of issue, where a lot of, where migrants have obviously appeared over the channel, the Rwanda flights, etc. That's really been the kind of major sort of axis point that has allowed the populist right to recover. But we must bear in mind the context here. Sure, Reform have got 4 seats and Nigel Farage has managed to enter Parliament and it's got 15% or so of the popular vote. This is very, very small in comparison to the National Rally in France. So it's absolutely right that the populist right has done fairly well in this election in terms of vote share, not in terms of seats, but I think it's roughly in the range that it has been really since 2010 with UKIP and the Brexit Party, and Reform is now the legacy party to that. And They have won some seats this time, but it's really a question of whether they're able to kind of build on that, or will just sort of be a kind of a semi-detached part of politics that's mainly just sort of harming the Conservative Party rather than actually forwarding, something sort of distinct that can actually have political influence.
Luke Blaxill, a historian in modern British politics at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us here on Paris Direct.